Hi there, my name is Simon, and as you can see from the slide here, I am a PhD candidate at Cornell University from the Department of Anthropology. Now, for today, I'm going to talk about a few concepts that I think will be very useful to consider as we begin our journey into the remarkable worlds of money, I said here. And specifically what I'll be looking at in this presentation are Western ontologies, so sort of the foundations of Western thought, in particular nature culture, and then a subtended binary between economy and society. Now, Western thought has sort of oscillated historically between nature and culture, and so we'll get into this. Now, the outline of my presentation, I'm going to focus on three things. So first, to give the audience an idea of what anthropology is, I will give a few principles of anthropology. Second, I'll focus on the Western ontology, so the foundational pillars of Western metaphysics. Nature and culture, and I'll spend the majority of the time of this presentation on that element because it's not something we'll be really considering as we move through the seminar, but I think it's a very important framework to consider. And then I'll lightly touch on economy and society because we'll be looking at the relations between economy and society in our explorations of money more closely throughout the seminar. Now, so anthropological principles. Is it okay if I walk back and forth? Is it okay? Okay. So I thought a good way to describe anthropology first is to compare it, like a literary foil, with sociology. So sociology and anthropology share many of the same theorists. For example, foundational theorists would be Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. But the two disciplines diverge quite dramatically, in particular in the parts of the world that they've explored. So sociology has focused mostly on the so-called modern world, Europe, starting with Europe. Looking at processes in particular of modernization. The development of capitalism, secularization, so the separation between church and state, or the continued relationship between these two. While anthropologists went out of the Western world and far away into these exotic, isolated, primitive lands, so-called. And so in the second portion here you can see the notion of historical teleology. Now, teleology refers to a kind of a historical progression that ends in a sort of endpoint. And the assumption here from the Western world is that the whole world was following a single unilineal kind of historical trajectory with the modern world at the very top, and then you have primitives down below, and for example barbarians, semi-civilized people in the middle. This is sort of the assumption by which anthropological thought unraveled. And there's a typo. Is that okay? Is that going to be okay? It's okay? Yeah. Right. So I wanted to outline here that historical teleology is not, it's still around with us today. So to give a few examples, this is actually an old. This is not the final version, unfortunately, of this presentation. Anyway, it doesn't matter. This is the draft beforehand. So I thought of Walt Rostow. If anybody knows Walt Rostow, he was an economist from the 70s and 80s. He informed, modernization theory, and he sort of talked about economic developments, how, traditional economies would eventually take off and then, industrialize and eventually become sort of consumer-oriented economies. The notion of comparisons, we use comparisons all the time. In Korea, you hear it all, very frequently. Europeans will deploy comparisons often. So, for example, if I were to say, Koreans might say things like, is it okay if I say this, by the way? So Koreans might say things like, the U.S. is like 20 years ahead, or something like that, or Korea is ahead of, some Southeast Asian country, or something like that. Then we have, another assumption between simple tools to complex machines. So we imagine that, in the past we lived in a kind of simpler world where, people made the tools that they would use themselves. And now we live in a world where we are sort of, our social relations are governed by machines. If you think of like, our, smartphones are eroding our personal relationships, things like that. But anyway, you can see this kind of like teleology from a simpler, world to a very complex world that we live in today. Or, the same goes, you have the same kind of analogous teleological thought with money. So you have like, primitive money that, non-Western countries would have used to the modern money that we have today. So like primitive money is equivalent to like simple tools, while modern money is this kind of society shaping force, right? So, sort of like a complex machine. Is that clear enough? Does that make sense to everybody? You doing good so far? Okay, and then I wanted to move on to the 1960s. The 1960s, there was a revolution across, much of the Western world, in particular, Europe, many European cities, and the U.S. There were countercultural, anti-war because of the Vietnam War, anti-colonial, gay and lesbian rights, feminist movements that really shook Western countries. Some of the results of this were, it had a deep impact on universities and university departments. So the, new university departments arose out of this, such as, gender studies, critical race studies, for example. And for anthropology, it deeply impacted anthropology because anthropology came to the realization that by, deploying knowledge that reinforces these kinds of teleologies from primitive people to the modern world, then it directly or indirectly legitimated colonialism for European countries and imperialism in the American context. Because if you say, for example, that a certain people are primitive savages, then an imperial administration might say, oh well, then we are it's perfectly legitimate for us to colonize them because we should educate them, So for anthropologists, that they had actually taken part and actually aided the expansion of imperialism and colonialism throughout its history was kind of soul-crushing for the discipline. And so, anthropology came under a crisis, and they began to sort of question, basic thoughts of like primitive and modern, historical, ahistorical, and became very critical of Western thought and began to analyze Western thought. And so this is sort of what we have here. How are we doing so far? So good? Is there anything unclear?
I don't understand when rethinking binaries.
Oh, yeah. Well, binaries, okay, so binaries refer to, a duality between two things. So again, like primitive, modern, or the primitive, in a sense, like, because everybody sort of, the assumption is that everybody develops on a single unilineal historical trajectory. Going back to visit primitives is like going back in time and seeing, Europeans in earlier forms, that people that would eventually become like, modern Europeans. So there's, these distinctions that they were like, okay, these are sort of actually very damaging assumptions, right, in their association with imperialism and colonialism. So they wanted to really question these and complicate them. So here we have Western ontology, and I'm going to focus on nature and culture here. So anybody familiar with the term ontology? Maybe you are in your readings in philosophy.
Well, ontos, the being, and logos, the logos.
Okay, yeah. That's a maybe more involved definition. Right. I mean, but I sort of give, just a very simple kind of like way of looking at it. So it's a branch of philosophy that explores the basic categories with which we make up reality. And in Western thought, there are two of these. There's nature and culture, dualism, and we can sort of go between these two. So what if I was to ask you, what is nature? How would you define nature? It's a simple term that we use every day, but at the same time, nobody really knows how to define it because it's so pervasive and diffuse. Anybody?
Not something artificial.
Not something artificial? All right. That's good.
Green.
Sorry?
Looking good, green.
Looking green, yeah. Actually, if you go with not something artificial, that would mean something that's not not human-made, right? That's good. And, sorry, what did you say? Not?
Looking green.
Looking green, yeah. Typically, like nowadays, when you think of nature, you think of like naturescapes, forests, mountains, these kinds of things, right? Natural landscapes. Probably because they're hard to find nowadays in many parts of the world. Basically, in the most a simple way of considering nature, we might think of it as a domain that does its own thing, right? That's sort of outside the realm of human influence, let's say. Of course, we can't, scientists, for example, will go, they study, nature, trying to understand it, how it operates, kind of the laws of nature. Engineers will try and master the forces of nature by, building buildings, bridges, dams, things like that, right? But basically, it's kind of a thing that it's kind of independent of humans. Now, culture is anybody with a mic? Anybody want to give it a stab?
Is it something man-made?
Yeah, there you go. I guess that pretty much sums it up, right? Culture is what we make. It's sort of like our property, our realm. It's our domain. We make this stuff. And then I've got a few subtended categories just to clarify things. So yeah, so culture is human, as opposed to nature, which is just non-human, right? And then culture, you have the self, and then nature, you have the other. And maybe you can edit this out. I was just thinking to clarify, to illustrate. If you think of like like genocide or capital punishment, these kinds of things. Genocide, you might talk about populations you want to annihilate as cockroaches or rats, things like that, right? As a non-human other, and then it legitimates kind of, right? Or a murderer that the government wants to kill might try and define them as a monster, not a human. I don't know if that if that works. And then I've got another example between of mind and body. Anybody know who popularized this distinction? Yeah,
Descartes.
Descartes. So I've got here Cartesian duality, mind and body. I don't know. Maybe you can cut some of this stuff out. Maybe my presentations need quite long, but anyway, whatever. So, anybody know what this is? Sorry?
Writing machine or something? Humanoid or something?
A humanoid writing machine? Yeah. It's called an automaton. And they were very popular in the 1500s, 1600s. This one's from the 1800s. So, 1600s is when Descartes was around. Now, an automaton, they were built by clockmakers. There were a lot of clockmakers, and what they wanted to do was to demonstrate their particular skills. They wanted to stand out from other clockmakers, and so they made these incredible machines called automata to demonstrate how awesome they were, how great they were at building clocks. Now, when people saw this, people would see, let's say at the shop window, they might see an automaton, and then think to themselves, in many ways, in similar ways as we might consider, AI today. Like AI and humans, there's a kind of blurring of the boundaries between human and machine, in a sense, perhaps. Now, people back then, when they see an automaton, this is, of course, before, much of the printing press. There was research on the human anatomy, but people, in general, didn't know how the body operated. They had no idea what was inside. So to them, all this mechanical stuff, it could have been what's inside their bodies. And so they thought to themselves, wow, is this the same thing as me? Am I an automaton? Like they began to question what made them human. And so Descartes came, and then he came and said, yes, our bodies are mechanical. We are just like animals, but what's the popular phrase? Yeah, which means?
I exist. Yeah, I think therefore. Yeah,
I am. Yeah, I think therefore I am. And so, anyway, mind-body. Which is interesting when you think about it because, yes, this kind of connects us to nature in a sense, right? The mind-body duality, because your body is made of, nature. It's this kind of thing that operates kind of on its own. You don't really know what it does. So it's kind of an interesting problematic. Now, I was thinking of focusing on these two. So, objective. To be objective is to sort of detach yourself from your observation of a particular phenomenon, right? And the assumption here is that it's universal because anybody else who looks at this particular phenomenon objectively will see the same thing, right? So there's a kind of idea of objectivity. Now, subjectivity is from my specific point of view. It's my particular way of looking at the world, and it's only relative to me. It's not shared with anybody else, right? So these are sort of principles of culture and nature you can see here. Everything's clear? Now, anthropologists, what they typically do, nowadays, that is, whereas in the past, anthropologists would have only looked at this, and then all of this would have been up to scientists. But what anthropologists do today is they try and, erase this line and mash it all together and make an analysis out of that. Now, I want to point out some of these extreme positions. So this is dualism, and we're looking at the relationships between nature and culture, right? But monism refers to one thing. There's only one principle, one explanatory factor to explain all of the diverse phenomena around the world. So if we consider a few of these. So again, naturalism is like to take nature, to its extreme. So we have an idea, one of these would be called determinism. Are you familiar with determinism? Anybody want to try?
It's the belief that our future is kind of like, or a lot of what we do is determined by something.
By something.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So here you have a couple of examples I brought up, like technological. Technological determinism would be that all of our lives are determined by the technologies with which we surround ourselves. So, my life is determined by my smartphone, or my life is determined, or society is determined, is shaped entirely by money, for example. Now, genetic determinism. And I know, you brought up, Richard Dawkins last time, right? Like with the selfish gene. And that would be an example of genetic determinism. So, all of the cultural variations that exist around the world, they're interesting, but fundamentally, down below, it's all about the genes. It's just genetics are telling us to reproduce. We do it in different ways, but fundamentally, you can bring it down to a single factor. All right? Everything just circles back to one factor. Universalism here, so again, it's taking objectivity to its extreme, such that all different phenomena are fundamentally commensurable with one another, right? All the cultural differences that exist in the world, again, they're all brought together by one single underlying factor, right? That's fairly clear, right? The monism, naturalism. Now, on the other end, you have this monism for, culturalism. So one of them would be like social constructivism. So social constructivism is the idea that we make the world with our cultural imagination. With our collective imagination, we make the world. So I put tech as empty container here, so it's the other extreme of technological determinism. Whereas technological determinism, technology defines society. In this case, it's society defines technology in its entirety, right? Extreme positions of social constructivism would say something like, the moon, the sun, and the solar system are all just manifestations of our collective cultural imagination at the most extreme, right? And this is relativism. So, absolutely incommensurable. If I were to take an example, from this room, for example, I would say that if you were to say like absolute relativism, then me as a Canadian can never understand you as Koreans because we are completely, absolutely, fundamentally different. All right? This would be the extreme position. I got a few more examples of naturalism. Sociobiology, society defined by biology. Behavioral psychology, maybe you're familiar with behavioral psychology? Yeah? I read an article once of a student. She had broken up with her boyfriend, and she was like, "Oh, the process is going through my mind. All these secretions making me feel certain things. It's the same as cocaine withdrawal." So, all of our emotions are basically just chemical release, hormonal releases in the brain. And then general equilibrium theory and rational actor model. Economists might say things like, fundamentally, we are all just self-interested economic actors. That would be a naturalist, determinist position.
My question is here, do you think a lot of the modern economists, they take the position of sort of like naturalistic and deterministic point of view?
Yes, they do. However, and I'm gonna go on this because I don't want to, I may be giving the impression here that this is like a problematic, highly reductionist position. And, in some sense it is. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that it's not accurate. You see? Like in the sense that modern money defines many of our social relations today. I mean, in many instances, if you actually look at it, it's quite accurate. But I'm going to get to that at the end, actually. I'll come back to that. So I'm trying to encourage us to, as we aboard this seminar, to linger in this area. But we're going to be exploring a lot of this stuff. The reason why we'd explore this stuff is that this particular branch of monism is far more powerful than this particular branch. I mean, if you consider, I was to say, yeah, my research is applicable to every single human being in this planet, as opposed to my research is applicable to 2 people. I mean, who's going to get the money, right? So most disciplines try and move to this area to have more universal application, to claim a stronger sense of reality, because this one is just too small and not attractive to a lot of groups. Good? Oh yeah, I guess I'll go into this. So just to illustrate naturalism and culturalism. So naturalism would be, here are C's for culture. So you have different cultures around the world. They're all different. They're all unique in their own way. But fundamentally, they're all determined by nature, by some natural factor. You could say technological or genetic or economic, whatever. While the culturalism point of view is that each culture is completely incommensurably different from the other, and each one of them define their own laws of nature, if they have laws of nature. Sometimes they don't. But the nature is within the particular cultural framework. So their particular, definition of nature is defined through their particular cultural lens. Cool? Now I'll move briefly to economy and society. So again, we're looking at nature-culture and a subtended dualism between economy and society. Now here, economy you can define it in all kinds of ways, but I'm just going to define it here as resources and wealth. So just stuff, right? All the non-human stuff that we have, that we produce, that we consume. This would be, what you would consider the stuff of the economy. Society would be just human relations, so how people relate to one another. Now in anthropology, again, we're going to be looking at, or we try to look at the relations between these two. But there's this popular way of considering the world, this popular sort of narrative of economic growth. Again, it's a kind of teleological progression called the Great Transformation, and maybe you've heard of it from, Karl Polanyi wrote The Great Transformation, and he writes about sort of how traditional economies used to be embedded, in the sense that the economy and the society were bound together, right? Whereas as history moved along and countries modernized, then the economy became disembedded in the modern world. And what this looks like is this. I hope you can read that. So an embedded economy, economy, society, they overlap mostly. Not every social relations is within, the realm of exchange, and there are a few, still a bit of market exchange in these sort of, so-called traditional societies. Now, the disembedded economy of the so-called modern world is that the economy has been detached from society and now determines entirely social relations. Right? So, as you can see, obviously, this kind of, disembedding is a sort of like naturalist point of view. So, I have this, modern money, general purpose money, which means that it's, the great equalizer means that it makes everything commensurable, right? I used that word before, if you remember. Commensurability means it can create relationships between anything. Anything can be calculated. If anything can be calculated in monetary terms, then anything can be exchanged. Anything can be marketized, right? And here we have, after the Great Transformation, you'll have alienable objects, i.e. commodities, so objects with price tags, between independent transactors, so between people that don't know each other, don't have to know each other, they don't care about one another, right? There's no sense of, in exchange, building social relationships. It doesn't matter in a market exchange. Now, anthropologists sort of accepted in the past this kind of distinction, and they went to look at, so-called primitive money. Special purpose money means that it could be used for particular purposes in certain spheres of exchange, and there were different ones, So if you were to define sort of the exchange in these, so-called traditional contexts, it would be inalienable objects, so like objects that people themselves make and then go in exchange with somebody that they know. Between dependent transactors, relations of kin or family, these kinds of things. And mostly this was defined to be sort of non-market exchange, mostly because sometimes there is evidence that some of these were market exchanges.
I just got a quick question.
What's up?
Yeah. What do you think about Bitcoin? Is the Bitcoin special purpose money, or is it completely disembedded form of money?
Great.
What do you think?
So I was moving towards this, actually. So to say that what happened with anthropologists, we're going to read Zelizer in week 3. And what she does is she takes Because what anthropologists, again, what they did was that they went to faraway places and looked at primitive money, but they left modern economies alone. This was the domain of sociologists. So, but with somebody like Zelizer and a few other people, what they did was they took this particular analytical method and brought it into here, or they brought this into here. So they took the lens of primitive money with special monies, between sort of that the market is not this kind of like domain that's detached from society, but rather that it's embedded, right? And so they basically analyze modern money as a special purpose money. As something like this, not like this. Okay? Is that fairly good? I don't know if that's clear. Because we're going to get into this kind of thing, right? So like that's sort of the history. Is everything okay? I know it's like I'm doing it in English, and it's also like some of the language I might be using might be difficult, and it's brand new concepts. But anyway, the more important one was nature culture. This part is secondary because we'll be looking at this stuff in far greater detail throughout the seminar. I just wanted to introduce it briefly. Good? All right, so, whoops, sorry, I'm going up. Now I wanted to, so here I brought in the gift. And I wanted to use the gift. So like, because anthropologists are taking modern money and bringing it into the analytical framework of primitive money, or using the analytical framework of primitive money to consider modern money, the gift is part of these kind of like archaic societies. And it's an interesting model to consider when you think of modern money. So, does anybody know the gift? Has anybody read Marcel Mauss? Marcel Mauss was an anthropologist from the early he wrote this in the early 1900s, 1928 maybe. And he was the nephew of Émile Durkheim. I think you've mentioned that before. And he considered the gift. And the way he looked at it was as a total social phenomenon. Meaning that as an object of reciprocal exchange, like if you just consider a gift, if you receive a gift from somebody, you're locked into a relationship with that person, whether you like it or not, right? You are in a debt relation, and you have to give something back to them. Like you owe them. It's stronger than you. You just have to, right? And if you don't, then that's like a very bad sin. So what he said was the gift pervades society. It brings together material, social, cultural, economic, moral, etc. dimensions. It's kind of like an object-oriented analysis. You consider one gift. You consider one object, the gift, and you sort of observe how it circulates throughout society. And what it does as it circulates is it composes and is composed of social relations, i.e. the gift creates society, and society creates the gift, right? So we have the gift economy, right? So we have economy and society weaved in together, and these two, are constantly, so it's a very sort of dynamic model, right? And this is something about capitalism. Capitalism and money are dynamic models. They're defined by motion, and the faster they move, the more accumulation people get in capitalism, or maybe the more inequality. There's a famous example by David Harvey. I don't know if you know him. He's a famous geographer. And he writes about post 9/11 in the USA, and like George Bush came and he said, everybody get back on the planes. Come on, start flying. Because if they're not flying, that's going to like really harm the economy. So it demonstrates the principle of motion, that it has to circulate all the time. And so money is this thing also that is a result of society, but also produces it. So anyway, so gift is a model. Money as embedded social form is what I'm trying to point out. And the gift is just one of many models. It's not the model, it's not the best form, tool of analysis, but it's one that you can use to appreciate the wider way, to consider, right, all right, sorry, many models would be, to appreciate the wide diversity of uses and pragmatics, because we're looking at the uses of money. One principle that's important to consider here is that defining money is very complicated because because money always evades clear and clean definitions, right? And so you want to really focus on the way it's used and the kinds of forms it takes as it circulates across and within different cultures. Because in one culture you have many different money forms. As it circulates, it'll take different forms and meanings, and you have also between different cultures you'll have different money forms. So the objective here, one of the objectives, and do what you will with this, is to develop a wide array of analytical tools with which to consider money's forms in order to construct flexible and precise, right? Because you want to be flexible with money because money is constantly very dynamic, and precise because as money moves, it takes on different forms, and so you want to be precise about the particular forms it takes in particular contexts. Precise analytical frameworks and perspectives. Now I wanted to point out something that Nigel Dodd points out in his introduction. He brings up a philosopher named Richard Rorty, who was an American pragmatist philosopher. Really interesting philosopher. I highly recommend him. And what Richard Rorty said, he called something final vocabulary. So determinist positions are final vocabulary. That there's really no way out of this way of thinking. So it's where doubt stops, right? If you're a determinist, you don't have a doubt. You're like, it's this, and it's only this. Right? And circularity begins. Circular thought in the sense that the thing always comes back onto itself. It's always this same thing. Where coherent and open-ended debate no longer seems possible. So once you have, a final vocabulary, it becomes very difficult. So if somebody has believes in a final vocabulary, it's very difficult to argue with them. The only way you can construct, a bridge of understanding between this person is if you agree with them, but not vice versa. Now, last slide. Sorry. I wanted to go back to this, your question about naturalist position in economics. So let's take, I brought up, rational actor model and modern money. So the rational actor model, economists will say things like, it's human nature to pursue one's self-interest. That's it, all right? Modern money, after the Great Transformation, while modern money is a product of history, it now determines human relations. And that's it. These are all sort of final vocabularies, right? But if we assume these models as starting points, as assumptions, we no longer approach them as analytical categories. So the rational actor model and modern money relations are, indeed real. I'm trying to say that they are real, that there are many instances when people are rational actors. They really exhibit that particular theory. That theory is accurate in the real world. And modern money relations, like social relations eroded by modern money, or defined in large part by modern money market relations, these things do occur in the world in many instances. But the question is, we shouldn't just assume them to be starting points, but how do they come into being? Under what conditions are they reproduced in everyday life? So the rational actor and modern money relations are not starting points as assumptions, but rather achievements that need to be continually reproduced. So how is the rational actor model achieved? What conditions are required for people to behave in this way? And you can think of Bitcoin miners, Are they rational actors because they're adhering to human nature? Or is it that the system itself gives them very little choice but to pursue a particular kind of rationality? That would be an example to illustrate this. So that's the end of my presentation. All I wanted to say was, to keep in mind flexibility. What was the other one? Precision and curiosity. Thank you.